erectus, Peking man, Sinanthropus pekingensis was the name of this individual. 40 individuals were said to have found back in the 1920s over near what was then called Peking, China. Now it's called, of course, Beijing. And these individuals were thought to document intermediate status between modern humans and some ape-like creature. Well, the difficult problem here was that all of these specimens were conveniently lost, and we don't have them today. So we really don't know what was found. But what was really fascinating, this particular site, what was actually found are some modern Homo sapiens skeletons. We have those, but it's rather interesting. We do not have these specimens. Conveniently lost, no way to know what they actually were. Now, in Africa, we do find Homo erectus specimens. This was what I did my master's thesis on. I spent 5 years studying every Homo erectus skeleton worldwide. That was really difficult. My professor made me look at papers in French and paper in German. I had to study every Homo erectus specimen there was. The thing that was so interesting as I began to look at the different specimens of Homo erectus is how human they actually turned out to be. Here we see on your left a specimen, there if I can get it right, of a 12-year-old boy, WT 15,000 from Africa. And this particular individual, although he was only 12 years old, was 6 feet tall. And so that's rather interesting because you always think of early ancestors, hominids, as being shorter and somewhat brutish. And here this individual at 12 years old was about 6 feet tall, dramatically different than the story you're told. And then there's a large number of other African Homo erectus specimens, K&M 3733, 3732, and so forth. You don't need to know the numbers, it'll bore you to death, but just know there's lots of Homo erectus specimens. Now, when I look at Homo erectus, I see human. You say, but wait a minute, look at that brow ridge. It has this supraorbital torus, as they say. And what's really interesting is I began to study that. I thought, well, wait a minute. Okay, it has the same 206 bones that we have. There's evidence of fire. There's evidence of tool use. They didn't have the technology we have today, but neither did your grandparents. And so is it human or is it some ape-like intermediate? Well, as we go back in time, what's interesting is dentition is bigger because people ate a much more grainy, non-processed diet. Okay? A few hundred years ago, they didn't have things like fine cutlery, blenders, meat tenderizers, and so forth. And so the shape of your face and your dentition is directly related to mastication, okay? The crushing and processing of food. And so you need heavier, thicker bones facially in order to do that. That's the only difference. That is the only difference between us and Homo erectus specimens. Clearly human beings, in my opinion. Okay, now one other taxa I want to talk about for just a minute before I move into more what I think are interesting specimens. Homo habilis. This is always cited as an intermediate group between the Australopithecines and Homo erectus. But what's so fascinating about this group, it seems to be very strongly a false taxonomic group. Whenever there's bits and pieces of specimens that they can't quite fit together, that they can't really define or denote as to where it belongs, they throw it in this grab bag taxa, which seems to be a false taxonomic group, and they call it Homo habilis or handyman. It's highly fragmentary. It's hard to tell exactly what these specimens are. I think in some cases they're true fragmentary remains of Homo sapiens, and in some cases they may be true fragmentary remains of apes, but not an intermediate form. Now, I want to spend some time on Neanderthals, or you'll notice the alternative spelling of Neanderthals. Either way can be correctly denoted. Even in the scientific literature, you will see both names used. So either one is actually correct. This is the older rendering, and some scientists have dropped the H in more recent times. But notice on the left here, you see this brutish, bow-legged, beetle-browed, half ape, half man. Here he is with his buddies on the way to a cave cookout of some kind, okay? And you notice they're always hairy, stoop-shouldered, bending over. You do with artist reconstructions what you cannot do with the actual fossils. What you see on the right is a more modern type of artist impression of what Neanderthals may have actually looked like. Well, let's look at some of the characteristics of Neanderthals and determine, were they humans, were they apes, or were they intermediate? Well, first of all, there's absolutely overpowering evidence that Neanderthals could speak, that Neanderthals had clear language. You say, well, how do you know that? Because we have found the hyoid bone. It's the only bone in your entire body that's not directly attached to any other bones. It actually is the bone that anchors your tongue and allows you to speak. I'm using mine right now. And allows you to speak fluently. Well, beginning in the 1980s, we began to find the postcranial remains of many Neanderthals. And at Kibera, in particular, they found the hyoid bone of a Neanderthal. And it was not a surprise for creationists that the hyoid bone looked exactly like modern Homo sapiens. Neanderthals could speak, there's no doubt. Here's what's really interesting. The brain size. The brain size of Neanderthals is actually larger than modern man's. Now, some of this, of course, could be due to body build or so forth, male versus female. So there's some other factors that relate to cranial capacity or brain size. But if it means anything, and it may not, Neanderthals on the average had a larger brain size than modern humans. So they certainly can't be ruled out as human based on that. Okay, where are you? Okay, there. Anatomy like humans, 206 bones, all of them in the same general, I should say specific, not general. All of them in the same specific location, all functioning the same way. Good evidence of manual dexterity in Neanderthals, the same kinds of functions that we had. They had culture. They buried their dead. There's good evidence that some Neanderthals that had wounds were cared for by other Neanderthals. This is a human type of characteristic. Here's the one that really separates them though. They made musical instruments. They made musical instruments. Now, I've never heard of any ape-like creature doing that. Okay, they made musical instruments. Oh, well, was it the harp? No. I'm glad you asked that question. But what they would do is take certain kinds of bones and drill precision holes in them and create flutes. Now, this is a human characteristic if there ever was one. I've already mentioned they buried their dead. Now, in addition to that, even though some of the simpler differences between Neanderthals and humans can be explained in other ways, there are some evolutionists, not all, but who have said, no, these two are totally different species. How do I account for any physical differences in Neanderthals? Well, first of all, there's only a few hundred Neanderthals ever found. They are basically located mostly in Western Europe, and they lived during the time of the Ice Age. That is really apparent. They did live in caves, but that doesn't mean anything. So does Osama bin Laden. So living in caves does not make them less than human. The reason they lived in caves was because they lived during the time of the Ice Age. Dramatic, catastrophic, post-flood, difficult place to live. And so because of that, they were basically hunters. Now it's interesting. They have the same exact toolkits that Homo sapiens living at the exact same time modern Homo sapiens have. They're practicing the same kind of things, burying their dead, using musical instruments, and so forth. Those are all evidences that these are indeed humans. The only difference that I can see between a Neanderthal and a modern Homo sapiens is their bones were thicker. Now, thickness of bones essentially denotes heavy use of muscle. If you use heavy muscle use, you have to house those muscles on something, and so you would have to have thicker bones to house those on.